Welcome, everyone. My name is Ryan Susky. I'm Director of Programs at the Ohio Center for Law-Related Education, and I'll be serving as your facilitator today for the Unit 4 hearing of the We the People National Invitational. In just a moment, I'm going to have the judges introduce themselves, followed, of course, by the students, and then we will begin the hearing. The process for today is that the students will deliver a 4-minute prepared statement, followed by 8 minutes of judge follow-up questions. My microphone is going to be muted during the hearing, and I'll be holding up the 1-minute end time signs. So for that reason, I do suggest that you have your settings to gallery view so that you'll be able to see your fellow students, your judges, and of course, my time signs as well. At the conclusion of the hearing, the judges will give brief feedback to the teams, and then we will conclude. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to your chairperson to begin the introductions.
We've eaten lunch. We've forgotten whose turn it was. I think it's mine. Okay. Well, good afternoon and welcome, and congratulations on representing Colorado again. As Ryan said, we'll introduce ourselves, have you introduce yourselves and your teacher, and then we'll turn to the business at hand. My name is Joe Stewart. I teach in the political science department at Clemson University in South Carolina, and always look forward to this. Relax. We're going to have a good time this afternoon learning from you about what you've learned about the Constitution. You muted yourself, Diana.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. Congratulations on making it to the National Invitational. I'm Diana Owen. I'm a professor of political science at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm Deshawn Whitaker, We the People teacher in Charles County Public Schools in Maryland.
Okay, please introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Sam Riggleman. I'm in 8th grade.
I'm Scout Chomas. I'm in 7th grade.
And I'm Sam Allison, and I'm also in 7th grade, and our coaches are Susan and Mike.
Okay, well, great. Well, again, thank you for the work that you've put in. We will deal with question 1 this afternoon, and so I will read that. An American historian claims that the ratification debates were one of the greatest and most probing public debates in American history. Do you agree or disagree? Why? What evidence can you offer to support your response? Evaluate the major arguments the Federalists advanced in support of the ratification of the Constitution. Evaluate the major arguments the Anti-Federalists put forth in opposition to ratification of the Constitution. Why did a Bill of Rights become a focal point for both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists? You may begin.
The ratification of the Constitution was indeed one of the greatest debates in American history, with 12 of 13 colonies meeting to review the Articles of Confederation and creating a document that still guides our government today. Initially, the debates were private, but once 38 of the 41 delegates signed the document on September 17, 1787, the debate very intentionally became public.
Madison worried that if approval remained in the hands of those in government, ratification was in jeopardy. So the delegates included Article 7, involving the colonists in each state in the ratification process and necessitating that 9 out of the 13 states approved the Constitution.
Colonists would elect men from their states to represent and review the Constitution. Following this process could then be considered entering into a social contract, obtaining the consent of the people to be governed by the new Constitution.
The debate became even more public through the publication of the Federalist Papers. These shared concerns about the rights of individuals warned the public that a strong federal government would surely trample on states' rights and threaten to future monarchy.
With strong leadership from Washington, the Federalists published 85 editions with clear arguments. The Anti-Federalists were less organized, less clear, and in the end, less successful.
At the core of the debate between Federalists and Anti-Federalists were 1, the power of the national government, the desired form of government, and the need for a Bill of Rights.
Federalists strongly believed that the central government needed more power than granted through the Articles of Confederation. They felt that this was necessary to protect the country for the government to fully do its job. The Necessary and Proper Clause and General Welfare Clause also contributed to the power of the national government.
Federalists argued that the Constitution included checks and balances, as well as a balance of power between the three branches to prevent the national government from having too much power. In addition, delineating certain powers to states protected state governments from being overpowered or destroyed by national government.
Anti-Federalists argued that too much power would eventually lead to the exact monarchy that colonists were trying to leave behind. The ability to tax and the ability to create and keep an army during peacetime were two examples of power Jefferson and followers believed that could be used to suppress the states and its citizens.
The Supremacy Clause was seen by Anti-Federalists as a means to make all national law more powerful than that of the states, and the Necessary and Proper Clause was viewed as much too general, granting excessive autonomy and power to the national government. Anti-Federalists feared the lack of individual and state power, a powerful executive branch, and the threat of a monarchy.
Secondly, Federalists were driven to create a republic reminiscent of the Roman Republic, believing that to have a successful large republic, power needed to be divided between state and national sectors. Washington and his followers believed that there was a clear lack of civic virtue as evidenced by Shays' Rebellion. Federalists agreed with Hobbes that individuals without enough government would default to their own individual needs over promoting the common good, convinced a strong national government would help prevent this.
Anti-Federalists were concerned that a republic with a large population was too big and diverse to agree on the common good. The fear again went back to the lack of ability for people to fully participate, and those not in close proximity to the hub of government being overlooked.
The final major point of contention was individual rights. The Federalists saw the Constitution as including the necessary language to protect the rights of individuals, while Anti-Federalists demanded a clear list of specific rights, including freedom of religion, speech, press, and assembly.
To list specific rights would be limiting, according to Federalists, as it would imply that only rights listed are protected. Anti-Federalists believed that if rights were not specifically listed, there was nothing to protect the people from the national government.
In the end, it was about compromise. A Bill of Rights became the central concept that brought both sides together. The Massachusetts Compromise led the way to 9 of 13 states ratifying. After months of intense public debate, the strong opposing views, and strategic compromise, the Constitution was successfully ratified and became the law of the land. We are now open for questions.
Well, thank you. You correctly characterized the Anti-Federalists as being less organized and therefore less effective. Is there anything in the process of writing the Constitution, or what we now call the Constitutional Convention, that would have led them to be less organized? Or were they just less organized people?
Well, it is important to look at who was at the Constitutional Convention or the writing and signing of the Constitution, and how the different opposing sides and opinions were represented. So there were not equal representation, which would lead to more or less organization.
In addition, I think that because Washington was a Federalist and he was one of the main leaders of all of the men at the Constitutional Convention, then I think that this really helped the Federalists to become more organized, as there was a clear leader to organize all of the events and things needed to create this public debate.
You talk about how the Constitution creates a Republican government. Can you talk about what it means to be a Republican government and how that compares to a Democratic government?
A Republican government is a government where the people elect representatives to represent them in a larger space, and a Democratic government is the entire community votes on certain problems.
Adding on to my panel mate, Republican government is people voting for a person who then votes for them, whereas a Democratic government is each individual vote counts towards the larger government and larger system. So it's more trickle-down effect.
One example of this is the Senate, or in elections every 2 years, to represent people, to represent the people in your own state.
All right. In your testimony, you discussed civic virtue. Why did the Federalists contend that they could not rely on civic virtue to make the new nation work properly? And do you agree with their position?
Well, in it, we talked about Shays' Rebellion, and I think that's a fantastic example because you saw in that situation where people without government did not help each other, did not attempt to form a new system that could coexist with one another. They rather looked more for individual needs over the larger picture.
Yeah. Adding on to my panel mate, the Civil War also included in a lot of this because the Confederacy broke away from the Union.
You pointed out that the power of the executive branch was a point of contention between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists were worried it would be too powerful. In one of the Federalist papers, the author says we need an energetic executive. Now that we've had a couple hundred years to evaluate this, which side was right? And how is this an issue that we continue to wrestle with today?
In my opinion, as modern technology advances and with the addition of social media, giving more normal people the ability to spread their voices on a larger platform, I think that it's harder for a country to become ruled by a total ruler. And so I think it was a little bit different 100 years ago, and the Anti-Federalists' beliefs were warranted coming out of that revolution. And I think, but to answer your question, I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer to the Federalist or the Anti-Federalist views.
In opposing opinion to my panel mate would be that the way the system is currently in place gives very little power to the individual people. It gives power to Congress, who people elect. It gives power to the Supreme Court, who people elect. But people don't actually have power in the system once they elect a president. So in that sense, opposing ideas were actually correct because you don't actually have a say in what the president does once you put your faith in them.
You mentioned the necessary and proper clause in your opening statement. What is the necessary and proper clause specifically? And can you give an example of how it's been used?
The necessary and proper clause is that all laws that are deemed necessary and proper can be put into action.
One example of this is the legislative branch creating a national bank.
Do you want to elaborate a little bit about that and the case, the Supreme Court case?
Yeah, so one of the first Supreme Court cases that established or really created linear rules around the supremacy clause, and then also the necessary and proper clause, was a case in which the state tried to tax the national bank, and through the supremacy clause, this was deemed unconstitutional, basically, and so they could not do that anymore because all national law is more powerful than state law.
And the example my panelmate just gave also has to do with the supremacy clause, which is the idea that the national government will always be more powerful than any state or individual government or right. So it's sort of tied into both.
All right, thank you. And we just had a conversation about power and people having a say. So I want to backtrack a little bit. And how and why do the state ratifying conventions exemplify popular sovereignty?
Would you mind restating the question?
So when the Constitution was ratified, they held state ratifying conventions. So, and we won't get the time to finish that one.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. It was you took clear positions that this was one of the greatest of the debates, and that that people's that particularly the Federalists saw the system in jeopardy. I really thought you did a good job of dealing with a lot of the nuances that we're dealing with here, that particularly bringing up, and that this we had not heard before, the importance of George Washington as a symbol. And you're exactly right. I mean, if George, for all the rules we had about ratifying once the 9 states had signed on, George Washington is such an important symbol here that I think his participation and agreement was crucial, and I thank you for bringing that up. You did a good job of mentioning the various constitutional provisions that were important, necessary and proper general welfare and supremacy clause, and didn't fall into the trap on executive branch of one side or the other, had a more nuanced answer. So very good performance today. Thank you.
Yes, I agree with my colleague. I thought that you did a really good job. I liked your prepared statement. One of the things that I think stood out with your statement was the fact that you had a really good discussion about the process, how they went about, coming up with the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the process of ratification. And you also placed their activities within a broader context. So I really like that. I thought you did a very solid job of talking about the Federalist and anti-Federalist positions, and kind of the issues that they ended up having to compromise on. I also like the way that the team worked together. You built upon each other's answers, but occasionally you disagreed with one another, but you did it very respectfully. So I thought that that's really good. It's always nice to hear a variety of opinions, and particularly when they're expressed in a respectful way. The only little thing I would raise is the fact that the Supreme Court is actually appointed by the president and, and then approved by Congress. They're not elected by the public. So that just a little point there. But overall, I thought you did a really nice job.
Yes, and I agree with everything my colleagues said. I appreciate that you brought up this idea of civic virtue and where it comes into play in this conversation. And you were able to provide Shay's Rebellion as an example of why we needed something done sooner rather than later. I appreciate your conversations about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. As it was already mentioned, you all had a very strong clear differentiation between them and what their arguments were and how they really did have to compromise with each other in order to get the Constitution ratified, and I would have liked to talk a little more about this debate being intentionally public and where the Federalist Papers really did fit into this, but we didn't have time to talk about that. But overall, great job, and I wish you luck in this competition.